Already in 2026, we've seen our first noticeable box office bomb, and unfortunately, it's for a fantastic film. 28 years later, The Bone Temple, the latest in the 28 Days franchise, is in my view a much stronger film than its predecessor. It has a clearer narrative structure, a more cohesive tone, and a story that understands its direction from the very first act. And yet, it was a box office disappointment. Meanwhile, 28 years later earned significantly more money worldwide despite receiving a far more mixed audience response. So, what happened? This isn't really a debate about quality, it's about timing, audience momentum, and release strategy. And in modern cinema, those things matter more than we sometimes want to admit. So let me start by saying this. I enjoyed 28 Years Later. It's a very solid film, it's ambitious and thematically interesting, and overall it was just exciting to see the franchise return. But structurally it feels divided. The first act largely exists to re-establish the universe, it reintroduces us to the rage virus, the state of the world, and the overall atmosphere. It functions almost like a reminder of what this franchise actually is. Then acts 2 and 3 dive into the central narrative. The shift is noticeable, the tone evolves very sharply, and whilst that isn't inherently a flaw, it does make the film feel slightly disjointed. By contrast, The Bone Temple is narratively cleaner. The story begins immediately, the first act sets up the central conflict, the second act escalates it naturally, and the third act resolves it with thematic consistency. There's cohesion in its structure, and it makes it feel more deliberate. Audience reactions reflected that as well. Reception to The Bone Temple was generally more unified, whereas reactions to 28 Years Later were more mixed. Some viewers loved its ambition, whilst others found its tonal shifts jarring. But here's the crucial point. Stronger audience reception does not automatically translate to stronger box office performance. And here's why. Financially, the difference between these two films is significant. 28 Years Later had a production budget of roughly $60 million and went on to gross over $150 million worldwide. It opened strongly and carried momentum through its theatrical run. Whilst it was a success financially, it wasn't a runaway success. The Bone Temple, on the other hand, had a similar budget, but has so far grossed only about $55 to $60 million globally. That's a major shortfall. As we all know, in general, a film needs to earn roughly 2 to 2.5 times its production budget to break even. Once you factor in marketing and distribution costs, that puts The Bone Temple's break-even point somewhere in the $100 to $150 million range. So it really didn't come close to making a profit. And that matters because this trilogy, spearheaded by Alex Garland, reportedly hinges on the performances of both films. The third installment depends on the perceived financial viability of the franchise. So in this video I really want to look at why this franchise, which is yet to have a box office disappointment, and for that matter a critical disappointment, managed to lose money at the box office. Because for me it wasn't a rejection of the first film, it was a problem of momentum, or rather the lack of it. And this is where the real issue lies. The two films were released far too closely together. There wasn't enough breathing room between them, and that decision may have cost the sequel its audience. When I spoke to friends of mine, general moviegoers, not franchise obsessives like myself, many of them didn't even realise The Bone Temple was a sequel. Some thought it was simply 28 Years Later finally being released, or that it was coming onto streaming. And that is a marketing and scheduling problem. When you release two franchise entries in a short window, you're assuming the audience is already built in. You're assuming everyone has seen the previous film, and that the brand has had time to solidify. But that wasn't the case here. 28 Years Later had a mixed audience reception. That doesn't mean it failed creatively, but it does mean word of mouth needed time to mature. It needed time to hit streaming platforms for rewatches, and overall for people to recommend it and for word of mouth to gather some momentum. Instead, the sequel arrived before that momentum could form. If 28 Years Later had been given a full year to breathe, to grow culturally, then audiences might have returned in greater numbers for the continuation. But because the films were positioned so closely together, the audience for the sequel had to already exist. And that's the problem. It didn't. This is where the difference between the two films becomes very clear. 28 Years Later benefited from being an event. It was the long-awaited revival of this beloved franchise, the continuation after years of silence. That anticipation drove opening weekend turnout. Even with the mixed reception, the curiosity factor carried it financially. The Bone Temple just didn't have that luxury. It wasn't an event, it was a follow-up, and follow-ups rely on satisfaction and built-in loyalty. If the first film's reception is divided and you don't allow time for its audience to consolidate, then the sequel opens to a much smaller core group. Box office is front-loaded, it rewards anticipation and urgency more than it rewards structural cohesion. And that's the uncomfortable truth. And there's another factor here, clarity. The title, 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, is a direct continuation. But to a general audience member who isn't following industry news, that distinction isn't always obvious. If people aren't sure whether it's a sequel, spin-off, or even the same film they heard about months ago, you're already facing an uphill battle. Franchise filmmaking depends on clarity of progression, and clarity takes time to build. And it's important to note that while 28 Years Later was financially successful, its audience reception was more mixed. And that matters, because mixed reception doesn't kill a film, but it does limit how aggressively people recommend it. When word of mouth is enthusiastic, it spreads quickly. When it's divided, it spreads cautiously. And without a year or more for that cautious spread to evolve into broader appreciation, the sequel inherits uncertainty rather than momentum. What this situation demonstrates is something we're seeing more frequently in modern cinema. Theatrical success isn't purely about quality, it's about timing, it's about clarity, it's about allowing audiences enough space to form attachment. Horror in particular often relies on cultural conversation. Atmosphere builds over time, reputation builds over time, and you just can't rush that process. When studios compress release windows to maintain momentum, they risk doing the opposite. They exhaust it. The overall box office disappointment of The Bone Temple came from releasing too quickly and not allowing an audience to build, combined with the mixed reception of the first film, limiting immediate return turnout. That's just a pure scheduling miscalculation. So overall, I believe Bone Temple is the stronger film. It's narratively cleaner, tonally consistent, structurally cohesive, but because box office doesn't reward these qualities, it rewards anticipation. And in this case, anticipation just didn't have enough time to grow from the first film. And this is a real shame if the third film doesn't materialise, because it won't be down to the overall quality of these two films, because they've been absolutely brilliant in my eyes. It's just because the momentum was rushed. And I do really think The Bone Temple just failed because the audience was not ready for this film to be released yet. But fingers crossed, maybe we will still see that third film with Cillian Murphy.